Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic collapse that Western officials had feared, anticipated, and desperately tried to prevent. A breakdown that unfolded not over weeks or months of careful negotiation, but in a single devastating press conference in Moscow. A single press conference that shattered months of diplomatic groundwork. A single press conference that left NATO allies scrambling to reassess their strategy. A single press conference that has now set the stage for what President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling the long war. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that Western leaders had hoped perhaps naively would hold. And when that line broke, Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with defiance, determination, and a sobering warning that has sent ripples through capitals from Washington to Warsaw, from Berlin to Bucharest. The peace proposal that took months to craft, that involved consultations with over 30 nations, that represented what many called the most comprehensive framework for ending this conflict since it began, was dismissed in less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes of carefully crafted rhetoric from the Kremlin. 15 minutes that revealed Putin's true intentions. 15 minutes that may have extended this war by years. Tonight, we break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what Zelensky's warning of prolonged conflict means for Ukraine, for Russia, for NATO, and for the world. For several weeks now, there had been signals not from official diplomatic channels, not from formal government statements, just signals that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unexpected. Putin has been predictable in his unpredictability, yes, but he has been methodical in his unpredictability. His diplomatic moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a pattern that Western intelligence services had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels and Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Kremlin communications know the indicators: the sudden reduction in foreign ministry briefings, the unusual silence from state-controlled media regarding the peace proposal, the unexplained postponement of Putin's scheduled address to the Federation Council, the sudden cancellation of a planned meeting between Russian and Turkish diplomats. All of that went quiet, and whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The NATO-backed peace proposal, which had been carefully constructed over a period of 4 months, represented what diplomats described as a realistic framework for ending the conflict. It included provisions for a phased withdrawal of Russian forces from certain occupied territories, international security guarantees for Ukraine, a pathway toward eventual EU membership without immediate NATO accession, and a framework for addressing the status of Crimea through long-term diplomatic negotiation. Western officials believed they had crafted something Putin could at least consider something that gave him enough face-saving provisions to bring to his domestic audience. They were wrong. The intelligence community had noted unusual patterns in the days leading up to Putin's response. Russian military units that had been repositioned appeared to be consolidating. Supply lines that had been dormant were suddenly active. And most tellingly, the rhetoric from Moscow's second-tier officials, the spokespeople and deputy ministers, who usually telegraphed the Kremlin's direction, had gone conspicuously silent. When the Kremlin goes silent, experienced observers know to brace for impact. Early Thursday morning, Kremlin officials detected what Western intelligence sources described as an unusual flurry of activity, including a hastily arranged press conference that had not been scheduled until just 6 hours before it occurred. These are the kinds of sudden diplomatic maneuvers that Putin only employs when he is signaling something very specific: complete rejection, strategic repositioning, or preparation for escalation. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing posture. And when a nuclear-armed autocrat shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency from Langley to London pays attention. The press conference itself lasted approximately 45 minutes, but the critical portion, Putin's response to the peace proposal, took only 15. In those 15 minutes, Putin systematically dismantled each provision of the NATO-backed framework. He described the proposed territorial arrangements as capitulation disguised as compromise. He called the security guarantees worthless paper from an alliance that has already proven its hostility. He rejected the EU pathway as a backdoor to NATO membership through economic colonization. And, most significantly, he declared that any discussion of Crimea's status was not a subject for negotiation now or ever. The rejection was total, it was comprehensive, and it was clearly premeditated. Intelligence analysts who reviewed the transcript noted that Putin's language was unusually specific, suggesting that the Kremlin had been preparing this response for days, possibly weeks, while the diplomatic community believed negotiations were still progressing. The warning issued by President Zelensky tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials after emergency consultations described Putin's dismissal as provocative, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, revealing of his true war aims. But diplomatic rejection only works if the target becomes demoralized. Ukraine did not. In fact, Zelensky's response today was among the most defiant we've seen since the earliest days of the full-scale invasion. Here's what we know within 3 hours of Putin's press conference. Zelensky convened an emergency session of his war cabinet. These weren't the routine consultations that happen weekly. These were crisis-level discussions, the kind of meetings that Ukraine only holds when they are preparing to fundamentally reassess their strategic posture. Within 6 hours, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people. Within 8 hours, he had spoken with the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland. Within 12 hours, he delivered his warning to the world. The warning was stark. Ukraine must prepare for a prolonged conflict, one that could extend well into the next decade. Zelensky did not sugarcoat the implications. He spoke of economic hardship. He spoke of continued casualties. He spoke of the psychological toll on a nation that has already endured more than 3 years of full-scale war. But he also spoke of resolve. He spoke of determination. And he spoke of an unshakable conviction that Ukraine would prevail, no matter how long the fight takes. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that following Putin's rejection, Ukraine launched a significant military operation targeting Russian logistics infrastructure, including a major fuel depot in Kursk Oblast that had recently been expanded for what analysts believe was preparation for a summer offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit the fuel depot at Kursk. They hit a command center in Belgorod that had been coordinating drone operations against Ukrainian cities. They hit railway infrastructure near Voronezh that was likely preparing to transport additional ammunition to the front lines. In other words, Ukraine targeted the backbone of Russia's offensive capability, the infrastructure that would have made a summer push possible. This is what made Zelensky's warning so significant. Putin's rejection wasn't just diplomatic theater. It was a signal that military operations would intensify. It represented the kind of strategic pivot that could reshape the battlefield if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't escalate to prohibited weapons systems. They hit military logistics. They hit command infrastructure. They hit the machinery of war. Defense analysts speaking to Western media noted that Ukraine's response demonstrated a level of intelligence capability and precision that has only improved over the course of the conflict. The targets selected were not random. They represented careful analysis of Russia's most critical vulnerabilities. The fuel depot at Kursk, for instance, had been identified months ago as a key node in Russia's supply chain for the southern front. Its destruction will force Russia to rely on more distant facilities, extending supply lines and creating additional vulnerabilities. The command center in Belgorod had been responsible for coordinating the drone campaigns that have terrorized Ukrainian cities for months. Taking it offline, even temporarily, provides critical breathing room for Ukrainian air defenses. And the railway infrastructure near Voronezh is part of the network that Russia uses to move equipment and personnel from its interior to the front lines. Disrupting it creates delays that cascade through the entire Russian military apparatus. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Putin's rejection was designed to test the resolve of NATO after months of internal debate about the future of Ukraine's support. Putin wanted to see whether the alliance would fragment, whether individual nations would begin advocating for Ukraine to accept worse terms, whether the pressure of a prolonged conflict would finally crack the coalition. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO didn't waver. They issued a joint statement that was so unified, so unequivocal, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today the Western alliance did. Intelligence officials speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Putin's calculation as a strategic miscalculation, a way to exploit perceived weakness that instead revealed surprising strength. But the alliance proved today that they remain both committed and coordinated. Their response was not only swift, it was synchronized so precisely that the statements from Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris appeared within minutes of each other, using nearly identical language. That synchronization matters because it shows that the internal consultations preceding the peace proposal had also prepared member states for the possibility of rejection. It shows that NATO is not simply reacting to events, they are anticipating them. The intelligence community had clearly wargamed this scenario. They had prepared response frameworks, they had pre-positioned diplomatic language, and when the moment came, they executed with a precision that surprised even seasoned observers. This represents a significant evolution in NATO's approach to the conflict. In the early months, the alliance often appeared reactive, scrambling to respond to Russian moves. Today, they demonstrated proactive coordination that suggests deeper institutional learning. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the international response to Putin's rejection. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte carried out emergency consultations with all 32 member states, forcing a complete reassessment of military aid. Timelines. The European Union targeted new economic sectors that had been under consideration for additional sanctions in the last several months, accelerating decisions that had been planned for later this year. The United States, operating through multiple channels, reportedly accelerated delivery of long-range strike capabilities previously delayed pending diplomatic outcomes. This wasn't just diplomatic disappointment. This wasn't just rhetorical condemnation. This was strategic realignment. This was coalition reinforcement. And coalition reinforcement is the one thing Russia has struggled to prevent since the invasion began in February 2022. For every diplomatic maneuver Moscow has made, the West has countered with something that strengthens Ukraine's position. The sanctions regime, while imperfect, has forced Russia to restructure its entire economy around wartime production. The military aid pipeline, while sometimes delayed, has provided Ukraine with capabilities that Moscow never anticipated. And the diplomatic isolation, while not complete, has reduced Russia's international standing to a degree not seen since the Soviet collapse. Putin's gamble was that rejecting this peace proposal would demonstrate Russian strength and Western impotence. Instead, it appears to have accelerated exactly the processes Moscow was hoping to prevent. Remember, Putin thought the peace proposal was a sign of Western exhaustion. He thought NATO's willingness to offer face-saving provisions indicated a desperation to end the conflict at any cost. He thought that a decisive rejection would create fractures within the alliance that Russia could exploit. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The alliance is more unified than it has been in months. Military aid announcements that had been delayed are now being fast-tracked. Countries that had been wavering on support are recommitting with renewed vigor. This pattern has repeated throughout the conflict. Each time Putin has anticipated Western weakness, he has instead provoked Western resolve. The initial invasion was expected to collapse Ukrainian resistance and divide NATO. Instead, it created the most unified Western response since the Cold War. The energy weapon was expected to break European resolve. Instead, it accelerated the continent's transition away from Russian hydrocarbons. The nuclear threats were expected to intimidate Western leaders. Instead, they strengthened the taboo against nuclear coercion. And now, the rejection of the peace proposal was expected to demonstrate Russian strength. Instead, it has revealed Putin's unwillingness to accept any outcome short of complete Ukrainian capitulation. History will likely record this moment as another in a long series of Russian miscalculations. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's rejection happened at a time when he is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Hardliners within the Russian security establishment want total victory, the complete subjugation of Ukraine. Economic pragmatists want an end to the sanctions that are slowly strangling Russian industry. Military leaders want relief from the grinding attrition that has cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties. And ordinary Russians, though their voices are suppressed, want an end to a war that has brought them nothing but grief. Putin is balancing these demands while facing the most significant military setbacks since the failed Kiev offensive. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The rejection of the peace proposal should be understood in this context. Putin needed to demonstrate to his domestic audience, particularly the hardliners, that he remains committed to maximalist war aims. Any acceptance of the NATO proposal, even as a starting point for negotiation, would have been seen as weakness by the factions that matter most to Putin's continued grip on power. This is the trap that Putin has constructed for himself. The war has created constituencies that benefit from its continuation. The military-industrial complex, the security services, the propagandists, the regional governors who have built their power on wartime mobilization. These actors now have vested interests in prolonging the conflict, regardless of its cost to Russia as a whole. Putin, who once controlled the narrative entirely, is now partially controlled by it. NATO's statement, now circulated to all member governments and international partners, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to abandon Ukraine, regardless of how long the conflict continues. Officials said plainly that Putin's rejection was inconsistent with any genuine desire for peace. That is diplomatic language for, "We know you're not serious, and we're done pretending otherwise." You don't usually hear that tone from the normally cautious NATO bureaucracy unless something serious is at stake. The statement went further than previous pronouncements. It specifically referenced Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, in the context of protecting NATO territory from any spillover of the conflict. It reaffirmed commitments to the security of Baltic states, and it announced accelerated military exercises in Poland and Romania. The message was unmistakable. Rejection of peace does not mean acceptance of Russian expansion. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, speaking after consultations with NATO counterparts, was equally direct. He described Putin's rejection as a choice for more war, more suffering, and more isolation. The UK's foreign secretary echoed these sentiments, adding that Britain would be announcing additional military support in the coming days. The German chancellor, historically more cautious in his rhetoric, described the rejection as a moment of clarity that demonstrated Putin's true intentions. And French President Emmanuel Macron, who has sometimes been criticized for seeking diplomatic accommodation with Russia, issued a statement that was notably harsh, describing Putin's decision as a historic error that Russia will regret. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people. "In your somber, determined speech tonight," he said, "today the world saw what we have known for years. Russia does not want peace. Russia wants submission, and Ukraine will never submit," he said. "We offered a path to ending this war with dignity for all parties. That path was rejected. Now we walk a longer road, but we will walk it together." And he said, "I will not lie to you. The years ahead will be difficult. They will demand sacrifice. They will test our endurance. But Ukraine has been tested before, and Ukraine has prevailed before. We will prevail again." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who has chosen to prepare his people for the long struggle ahead rather than offer false comfort. Zelensky's shift in messaging is significant. Throughout the conflict, he has maintained optimism about eventual victory, often speaking in terms of months rather than years. Tonight's speech marked a departure from that approach. He spoke frankly about the challenges of sustained mobilization. He acknowledged the economic difficulties that prolonged conflict will create. He addressed the fatigue that has set in after more than 3 years of war. But he framed these challenges not as reasons for despair, but as tests of national character. "All see em best," inquired. "Every great nation has faced moments like this," he said. "Moments when the easy path and the right path diverge. Ukraine has chosen the right path. History will remember that choice." The speech was broadcast not only in Ukraine, but also to international audiences, with translations provided in multiple languages. It was clearly designed to serve two purposes: preparing Ukrainians for what comes next, and signaling to international partners that Ukraine remains committed regardless of the timeline. These competing objectives will shape the coming months and years. The conflict has entered a new phase, one defined less by dramatic breakthroughs than by grinding attrition, industrial capacity, and societal resilience. Ukraine's advantages in this phase include continued Western support, superior morale, and the defensive benefits of fighting on home territory. Russia's advantages include larger population, greater natural resources, and an economy that has been restructured for war production. The outcome will depend on which set of advantages proves more durable and on whether external factors, such as political changes in Western capitals, shift the balance. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military positions for any signs of offensive preparation. They say that Russian forces have begun consolidating in certain sectors, suggesting possible repositioning for a major operation. They say that supply movements have increased along several key logistical routes. And they say Putin's decision to reject the peace proposal is likely part of a broader strategic recalibration intended to achieve military gains that would improve Russia's negotiating position for any future talks. But Ukraine is not waiting passively. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating its own preparations. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and proportionate, sent a message to Moscow that rejection of peace does not mean a free hand for aggression. And it sent a message to Western capitals that Ukraine remains a reliable partner that uses the support it receives effectively and responsibly. The military strikes conducted in the hours following Putin's rejection demonstrated not only capability but also restraint. Targets were selected carefully. Civilian areas were avoided. The operations were designed to achieve military objectives while minimizing escalation risks. This approach has characterized Ukraine's conduct throughout the conflict and has been critical to maintaining Western support. Even in moments of frustration, Ukraine has adhered to the norms that distinguish it from its adversary. As the hours go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with his comprehensive rejection of the peace framework. But what we do know is that the Western response was timely. It prevented the narrative from being controlled entirely by Moscow. It demonstrated alliance unity at a moment when Russia was hoping for division. And it reassured Ukraine that it would not be abandoned, regardless of how the diplomatic process unfolds. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next weeks and months. If he pursues genuine de-escalation, this moment will be remembered as a missed opportunity that eventually gave way to reason. If he pursues further escalation, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are watching. They have shown they are ready to respond. The mechanisms for additional support are in place. The political will remain strong, and the moral clarity that has characterized the Western response since February 2022 has not wavered. Putin's gamble was that time would favor Russia, that Western democracies would eventually tire, that the inherent complexities of coalition management would create exploitable gaps. So far, that gamble has not paid off, and tonight's response suggests it will not pay off in the immediate future either. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something that he has learned many times before, but seems determined to forget, that Ukraine will not break, that the West will not abandon its commitments, and that aggression, no matter how sustained, will not be rewarded. This story is far from over. The war that began in February 2022 has now entered its most uncertain phase. The hopes for a negotiated settlement that had been building for months have been dashed. The timeline for the conflict has extended indefinitely, and both sides are now preparing for a struggle that could last years. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine is ready for that struggle. Its partners are committed to supporting it. And the principles at stake, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the right of nations to choose their own future, are worth defending, no matter how long the defense takes. President Zelensky's warning of prolonged conflict was sobering, but it was also honest. And in a world too often characterized by evasion and wishful thinking, honesty is itself a form of strength. Ukraine has chosen the difficult path of truth over the easy path of illusion. And history, when it renders its judgment, will remember that choice. The coming months will test everyone involved. They will test Ukraine's endurance. They will test Western commitment. They will test Russian society's tolerance for endless war. They will test the international system's ability to uphold its foundational principles. But tests reveal character. And the character revealed so far suggests that this story, however long it continues, will end with the principles worth fighting for still standing. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. The world changed today, Not dramatically, not with headlines that will dominate for weeks, but fundamentally. The possibility of a negotiated near-term settlement has receded. The reality of prolonged conflict has advanced, and everyone involved, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, and the broader international community, must now adjust to that reality. For Ukraine, it means preparing for years of continued struggle. For Russia, it means accepting that quick victory is impossible. For NATO, it means committing resources and political capital for the long term. And for all of us watching, it means understanding that this conflict will shape international politics for a generation. Tonight's events were not the end of anything. They were the beginning of the next chapter, a chapter that will be written in sacrifice and determination, in struggle and resilience, in the daily choices of millions of people who refuse to accept that might makes right. That story continues tomorrow and the day after, and for as long as it takes, because some things are worth fighting for, and freedom, the freedom of a nation to determine its own future, is among them. This is the reality that President Zelensky acknowledged tonight. This is the reality that Vladimir Putin's rejection has created. And this is the reality that will define the years ahead. We remain committed to bringing you every development, every analysis, every insight as this historic conflict continues to unfold, because the story matters, because the stakes are real, and because the world is watching.